You were never invited." Those words hit me harder than the cold morning air outside the venue as I stood just a few feet from the entrance of what was supposed to be my sister-in-law Olivia Blake's wedding. Holding a small gift bag and wearing a simple navy dress I had chosen carefully to match the occasion, trying to look appropriate, respectful, and invisible all at the same time. I remember thinking that weddings in America were supposed to feel warm, welcoming, and full of family unity. But in that moment, the only thing I felt was the quiet weight of being unwelcome in a place I had emotionally prepared for over months. My name is Emma Carter, and until that day, I genuinely believed I was doing everything right in my marriage into the Blake family, trying to stay polite with my mother-in-law Margaret Blake, trying to support my husband Daniel Carter, and trying to be present for Olivia even when I could sense subtle distance growing between us. 3 days before the wedding, everything still looked normal on the surface, at least if you didn't pay attention to the small details like delayed replies to my messages in the family group chat, or the way conversations would pause for half a second when I entered a room, or how Margaret's smile never quite reached her eyes when she spoke to me. I told myself I was overthinking it, because that is what you do when you want peace more than clarity, but deep down I started noticing a pattern where I was included just enough to feel confused, but not enough to feel secure. I still remember the afternoon I was casually reviewing wedding details with Daniel at our kitchen counter in our suburban home, just outside Chicago, when I asked him if we should confirm parking arrangements for the venue, and he hesitated for a moment before saying everything was already handled by his mother. That pause felt small, but it lingered in my mind longer than it should have. I tried to brush it off, focusing instead on picking out a wedding card and deciding whether a gift card of $200 was appropriate or if I should add something more personal, because I wanted everything to feel right. What I didn't realize at the time was that I was slowly being positioned outside of something I thought I was part of. The shift became impossible to ignore the day before the wedding when I called Olivia to congratulate her and double-check the schedule, and she answered quickly but sounded rushed, almost rehearsed, saying she would see everyone tomorrow, without mentioning anything specific about my role or arrival time. I laughed it off on the call, telling her I was excited for her big day, but after we hung up, I sat in my car in the driveway for a few minutes longer than necessary, staring at the steering wheel while trying to convince myself that everything was fine. That is the strange thing about family tension like this. It doesn't explode at first. It accumulates quietly, like pressure building behind a locked door, until one day you realize you are already standing outside it. And that morning, standing in front of the wedding venue with soft sunlight reflecting off the glass doors, I felt that door finally close in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. Standing outside the glass doors of the venue, I remember adjusting my grip on the small gift bag just to give my hands something to do, while my mind tried to process the words I had just heard, because they did not feel real enough to belong in a moment like this. The morning air in suburban Chicago was crisp, carrying the faint smell of fresh-cut grass from a nearby lawn, and guests in soft formal attire were beginning to arrive in small groups, laughing gently, as if nothing in the world could possibly be wrong. That contrast made everything inside me feel even more unsettled, like I had stepped slightly out of sync with a world that was still moving forward without me. I turned slightly, hoping to see someone familiar, maybe Daniel Carter, my husband, or even Olivia Blake, my sister-in-law, but there was no sign of either of them at the entrance. Instead, it was Margaret Blake, my mother-in-law, who appeared just inside the doorway, dressed in an elegant pale blue outfit that matched the wedding theme, her posture straight and controlled in a way that always made me feel like I was being evaluated without words. She did not rush toward me or show surprise. She simply looked at me for a long second, as if confirming something she had already decided. When she finally stepped closer, her voice was calm, almost too calm, and she said that it would be better if I did not come inside today. There was no raised tone, no visible anger, just a quiet certainty that made the sentence feel heavier than if it had been shouted. In that moment, I felt a strange stillness settle in my chest, not because I did not understand what she meant, but because I understood it too clearly. I had spent months trying to find my place in this family, learning when to speak and when to stay quiet, learning how to smile through small moments of discomfort, believing that patience would eventually turn into acceptance. I remember thinking back to every family dinner where I brought a dessert from a local bakery, usually something simple like a chocolate cake or fruit tart, in every polite conversation where I tried to ask questions about Olivia's wedding plans without overstepping. I had thought those efforts meant something. But standing there, looking at Margaret's composed expression, I realized that effort and acceptance were not always connected in the way I believed they should be. Around us, guests continued to arrive, stepping out of cars and adjusting ties and dresses, completely unaware of the quiet shift happening at the entrance. A woman in a lavender dress walked past me, smiling as she greeted someone inside, and I suddenly felt like I was standing behind an invisible line that no one had bothered to tell me about until I had already crossed it unknowingly. My phone vibrated in my hand, and for a brief moment I considered calling Daniel, but something stopped me. It was not anger, and it was not sadness yet. It was something closer to clarity beginning to form, slow and uncomfortable, like a picture coming into focus that I did not necessarily want to see. Margaret was still watching me, waiting for a reaction, maybe expecting frustration or confusion or even an argument. But what I felt instead was a quiet pause, a moment where everything I had been ignoring started to align into a pattern I could no longer dismiss. I realized then that this was not a sudden decision made in a single morning. It was something that had been prepared in silence long before I arrived, long before I stood at that door holding a gift that suddenly felt meaningless in my hands. For a moment after Margaret Blake spoke, I did not move, not because I was unsure of what she meant, but because I was trying to understand how something so definitive could be delivered so casually, as if asking someone to step aside from a doorway was the same as telling them the weather might change later in the afternoon. The sound of guests continuing to arrive behind me made the moment feel even more surreal, like life had decided to keep moving in one direction while I was suddenly no longer allowed to follow. I remember the faint echo of footsteps on the polished stone walkway leading into the venue, the soft rustle of dresses, and the polite greetings that floated through the air just beyond the glass doors, creating a world that felt both close and unreachable at the same time. Margaret adjusted her posture slightly, her hands folded in front of her, maintaining that composed expression that always made it difficult to tell whether she was delivering a personal opinion or a final decision. She repeated herself, more slowly this time, explaining that today was already complicated and that it would be better for everyone if I simply did not enter. The phrase better for everyone hung in my mind longer than anything else she said, because it implied a collective agreement I had never been part of, a decision made somewhere without my presence or input. I could feel my thoughts trying to organize themselves, searching for something to hold on to, some logical explanation that would soften the impact, but nothing came. Instead, I became aware of how carefully everything had been arranged, from the timing of her appearance to the positioning of the guests arriving behind me, as if this moment had been rehearsed in silence long before I arrived. I glanced through the glass again, noticing the elegant floral arrangements inside, white and soft pink roses lining the entrance hall, and I remembered how I had once complimented Olivia Blake on her choice of theme, genuinely believing I was included in the process of something meaningful. Now those same details felt distant, like decorations belonging to a different story entirely. My fingers tightened slightly around the gift bag handle, and I realized I was still holding it as if it mattered, as if I had not already been repositioned outside the occasion it was meant for. I thought about Daniel Carter, wondering if he was already inside, if he knew I was standing here, or if he had also accepted this quiet separation without question. The absence of his presence at the door felt heavier than Margaret's words, because it left a gap where expectation used to be. I had expected confusion, maybe even a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a few sentences, but what I was beginning to understand instead was that clarity was not something being offered to me in this moment. It had already been decided elsewhere, and I was only now being informed of the result. Margaret's gaze remained steady, not hostile, not warm, simply final in a way that made further discussion feel unnecessary from her perspective. I felt a strange stillness return again, not the kind that comes from acceptance, but the kind that forms when emotion has not yet caught up with realization. Around us, the wedding continued to unfold without interruption, the flow of guests and greetings creating a steady rhythm that contrasted sharply with the quiet pause I was standing in. In that contrast, I began to understand something uncomfortable but clear. I was not part of a moment that was still preparing itself for me. I was already outside of it, and the door had not just closed. It had never been opened for me in the way I had believed. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt structured, like it had been placed there with intention, giving me just enough time to absorb what had been said without offering any space for immediate response. I remember standing there, still facing Margaret Blake, while the entrance behind her continued to fill with movement and light, guests stepping into a celebration that now felt like it belonged to a different layer of reality than the one I was standing in. My mind kept trying to find a way to reinterpret her words, to soften them into something less final, but every attempt collapsed under its own weight. There was no misunderstanding to fix, no tone to correct, no detail to clarify. It was simply exclusion, delivered with calm precision. Margaret did not look away, and that made it worse in a way I could not immediately explain, because it meant she was not avoiding me. She was fully aware of the impact of what she had said and still considered it appropriate. I slowly lowered my gaze for a moment, not out of submission, but because I needed to steady myself in a situation that was offering no emotional support for stability. The gift bag in my hand suddenly felt absurd, like an object that belonged to a version of this morning that no longer existed. I thought about how carefully I had chosen it, how I had walked through a store in Chicago 2 days earlier debating between a neutral decorative item and something more personal, believing that small details like that mattered in building connection. Now it felt like I had been preparing for a role I was never actually assigned. Behind the glass doors, I could see a staff member adjusting floral arrangements near the entrance hall, making small corrections to perfection that I would not be part of witnessing from inside. The wedding was continuing its preparation without pause, and that continuity made my stillness feel even more pronounced, as if I had been temporarily removed from the flow of time itself. I considered again whether to call Daniel Carter, and this time the thought stayed longer in my mind, not as a reflex, but as a real decision point. I could already imagine his voice, possibly calm, possibly uncertain, possibly avoiding the center of the situation altogether. That uncertainty did not comfort me. It complicated everything further. Margaret finally shifted her attention slightly toward the interior, as if signaling that her part in this exchange was complete, but she did not step away immediately. Instead, there was a brief pause where neither of us spoke, and in that pause I became aware of something subtle but important, the absence of any invitation to explain myself. There was no question asked, no space offered, no assumption that my perspective was necessary. That realization settled in more deeply than the initial words, because it confirmed that this was not a conversation, it was a conclusion already reached. I exhaled slowly, feeling the air leave my lungs in a controlled way, and I noticed that my emotions were not rising in the way I would have expected. There was no immediate anger, no visible distress, only a quiet internal alignment of facts that were beginning to make sense in a way that was uncomfortable but clear. Around us, the wedding continued to build itself, guests greeting each other, laughter rising briefly before fading into the background noise of preparation. I stood just outside that rhythm, fully aware that nothing I did in that moment would change the structure already in place. And for the first time since arriving, I understood that the question was not how to get inside, but why I had been positioned outside long before I ever reached the door. There is a certain kind of silence that does not feel like absence, but instead feels like pressure, and that is exactly what settled between me and Margaret Blake as the wedding continued to unfold just a few steps away from where I stood. I remember shifting my weight slightly on the stone walkway, not because I was uncomfortable in a physical sense, but because standing still in a moment like that made everything inside me feel more noticeable, more defined. Margaret had already begun to turn her attention back toward the entrance, as if the conversation between us had reached its natural end. Yet I remained there for a few seconds longer, not because I was waiting for her to change her mind, but because I was trying to understand how quickly a person could be repositioned within a family narrative without any formal explanation. The morning sunlight reflected softly off the glass doors behind her, illuminating the floral arrangements inside with a warm glow that contrasted sharply with the emotional distance I was beginning to recognize. I thought about the months leading up to this day, about every polite interaction I had carefully maintained, every attempt to contribute without overstepping, Every moment I had convinced myself that consistency would eventually be recognized as belonging. And yet, standing here, none of that seemed to carry weight in the present moment. The realization was not sudden, but it was becoming increasingly impossible to ignore. I slowly lowered my gaze toward the gift bag still hanging from my hand, and for the first time it did not feel like a gesture of goodwill, but rather a reminder of expectation that no longer had a recipient. Inside that small object was a version of me that believed effort naturally led to inclusion, and I could feel that version quietly dissolving under the weight of what was happening now. I did not speak, not because I lacked words, but because I was beginning to understand that words were not being invited into this situation anymore. Around me, guests continued to arrive in steady intervals, their conversations blending into a soft background rhythm that made the silence directed at me feel even more distinct. I noticed how easily they passed through the entrance, how naturally they were acknowledged, and how effortlessly they became part of the space I had just been told not to enter. That contrast was no longer surprising, but it was deeply instructive. It showed me something that no one had said out loud, that inclusion is often not negotiated in real time, but prearranged in ways that only become visible when you are the one left outside of it. I thought again about Daniel Carter, and this time the thought did not carry urgency or confusion, but a quieter form of observation. I wondered when he had last thought about this moment from my perspective, or if he had at all. The absence of his presence at the entrance now felt less like coincidence and more like alignment with a decision I had not been part of shaping. Margaret finally stepped slightly further inside, her posture unchanged, her expression still composed, and as she did, I noticed that no one inside the venue looked toward me, not because I was hidden, but because I was no longer part of the visual. Expectation of the day. That detail stayed with me longer than anything said aloud, because it confirmed something I was only beginning to fully accept. I was not being argued against, I was being bypassed. And in that distinction, something inside me shifted in a way that was quiet but irreversible, as I began to understand that the role I thought I had been playing in this family had never been as secure as I believed. After Margaret Blake disappeared further into the venue and the glass doors closed more fully behind her, I found myself standing in a space that suddenly felt wider and emptier at the same time, not because anything physically changed, but because the boundary between inside and outside had become more defined than it had been a moment before. The sound of the wedding continued uninterrupted, music faintly beginning to rise from somewhere inside, mixed with the soft murmur of guests settling into place. And I remember thinking how strange it was that a single person could be excluded from something that was still actively in motion. I shifted the gift bag in my hand once more, then slowly lowered it, holding it instead by my side, as if reducing its visibility could somehow reduce its meaning. In that moment, I became aware that I was no longer waiting for permission, because permission itself was no longer part of the equation I was standing in. My thoughts turned inward, not in panic, but in a slow, deliberate search for clarity, as I replayed the sequence of events that had led me here, from the quiet changes in communication to the subtle distancing in conversations, to the final sentence delivered without hesitation at the entrance. Each memory now aligned in a way that felt less confusing and more structured, as if I was finally seeing the outline of a plan that had been forming long before I arrived that morning. I considered again the role of Daniel Carter in this situation, and this time the thought was not about asking him for explanation, but about recognizing his absence as part of the pattern itself. There had been no moment where he stepped forward, no interruption, no visible uncertainty at the threshold where I was stopped. That absence carried its own meaning, one that I was not yet ready to fully interpret, but could no longer ignore. I looked through the glass doors again and noticed a staff member adjusting seating cards near the entrance table, carefully aligning names with places, and that simple act suddenly felt symbolic in a way I did not expect. Everyone inside had a position, a place, a defined presence that had been arranged in advance. I was the only one whose position had been removed before the arrangement was completed. My breathing remained steady, but my awareness had shifted into something sharper, something more observational than emotional. I was no longer asking why this was happening in the immediate sense, because that question had already been answered by the situation itself. Instead, I found myself noticing details I would have normally overlooked, such as the way guests were greeted by name as they entered, the way laughter rose and faded naturally inside the venue, and the way no one paused at the glass doors in confusion about my absence. That lack of disruption was telling in a way that words could not match. It suggested that what was happening was not an interruption of expectations, but the fulfillment of them. I remember exhaling slowly, not in resignation, but in a controlled attempt to steady the shift that was occurring internally, as I began to understand that what I had assumed to be a shared moment was actually a carefully separated experience. The wedding was not pausing for me, and it never had been designed to do so. And in recognizing that, something within me settled into a new form of awareness, one that did not yet have direction, but was no longer held by illusion. The wedding had fully begun inside the venue, and although I remained outside, I could feel the shift in energy as if I were standing at the edge of a moving current that no longer included me. Through the glass doors, I could see guests settling into their seats in neat rows, the soft glow of warm lighting reflecting off polished surfaces and floral arrangements that had clearly been designed with precision and care. The music had grown slightly louder, signaling the transition from arrival to ceremony, and that subtle change made everything feel more finalized, as if the day had now locked itself into motion. I stood still, not because I had nothing to do, but because there was no longer a version of action that would change the structure already in place. My attention drifted between small details inside the hall, such as the coordinated movement of staff adjusting programs at each seat, and the calm expressions of guests who had no awareness of the boundary I was standing behind. That contrast created a strange sense of separation, not dramatic, but deeply defined, like two parallel experiences unfolding in the same physical space without intersecting. I thought again about Margaret Blake, imagining her somewhere inside, likely positioned among the family seats, composed and fully aligned with the flow of the event. I did not feel anger toward her in that moment, at least not in a direct sense, because what I was beginning to understand was that her actions were not impulsive, but consistent with a pattern that had been forming long before today. The realization did not arrive all at once, but in layers, each one making the previous assumptions feel less stable. I shifted my weight slightly, feeling the stone beneath my shoes, grounding myself in something physical while my thoughts continued to organize themselves around what I now understood to be a separation that had already been decided in advance. My phone remained in my hand, but I had not called Daniel Carter, and the longer I stood there, the more that choice began to feel less like hesitation and more like observation. I noticed that I was no longer searching for immediate answers from him, because part of me had already started to recognize that his position within this situation was not neutral. It was part of the same structure that had placed me outside the doors. Inside, I could see movement beginning to settle as the ceremony was about to start, and there was a quiet sense of alignment among the guests as they turned their attention forward. No one looked toward the entrance where I stood, and that absence of acknowledgement no longer felt accidental. It felt consistent, as if my absence had already been accounted for in the arrangement of the day. I remember adjusting my posture slightly, not to appear different, but because I was beginning to feel the weight of standing outside something that was continuing without interruption. The gift bag in my hand no longer represented participation, but rather a trace of intention that had no place to land. As the first formal cues of the ceremony began inside, I realized that I was no longer in a position of waiting to be included. I was witnessing something I had once believed I was part of, now unfolding completely independent of my presence. And in that recognition, there was a quiet but undeniable shift, one that marked the beginning of understanding that this moment was not about being forgotten in real time, but about discovering how long I had already been positioned outside of it. As I stood outside the venue, watching the ceremony continue without interruption, there was a moment where the structure of everything I had assumed began to shift in a way that was no longer subtle, but clearly defined. Inside the glass doors, the guests had fully settled into their seats, and the atmosphere had transitioned into the formal beginning of the ceremony, with attention focused forward and all movement aligned toward a shared focal point. I could see the faint motion of someone at the front of the hall, likely the officiant, preparing to begin the proceedings, while the rest of the room held a collective stillness that contrasted sharply with my position just outside. It was in that contrast that something unexpected began to surface. A staff member near the entrance suddenly paused while checking a set of documents on a tablet device, their expression changing slightly, as if confirming information that had not been previously noticed. I watched as they stepped closer to one of the seating charts and made a small adjustment, shifting a name placement with careful precision. At first, it seemed insignificant, but then I noticed a second staff member approach, and their conversation appeared brief but focused, both of them glancing toward the interior of the hall before. Returning to the seating arrangement. Inside, there was a subtle ripple of movement among a few guests, a turning of heads, and a brief exchange of quiet words that did not match the expected flow of a ceremony already in progress. I did not hear what was said, but I could see the change in attention, as if something had been recognized at the last possible moment. My focus narrowed as I observed a person at the front row stand slightly and speak to someone beside them, then sit back down with a measured expression that suggested adjustment rather than reaction. The environment inside the venue remained composed, but there was now an undercurrent of recalibration, something being corrected in real time that did not align with the original arrangement. I remained still, not because I expected to be called inside, but because I was beginning to understand that something within the structure of the event was being reevaluated. My thoughts turned to Daniel Carter again, but this time not as a question of where he was, but as part of a system that I was starting to see more clearly. The absence of his presence at the threshold now felt less like distance and more like participation in a sequence I had not been informed of. Inside, I noticed movement near the central aisle, where a few guests subtly shifted in their seats, their attention briefly breaking from the front before returning forward again. It was not disruption, but adjustment, as if expectations had been slightly altered and everyone inside was recalibrating without drawing attention to the change. I felt a quiet stillness settle within me, not emotional in the traditional sense, but observational, as if I had stepped far enough back from the situation to finally see its structure rather than its surface. The realization was not loud, but it was precise. Something had been misaligned in the way presence and absence had been accounted for in this moment, and that misalignment was now being addressed without my involvement. I did not move toward the doors, nor did I step away. I simply remained where I was, watching as the ceremony inside continued to reorganize itself in subtle ways, and for the first time, I understood that the separation I had experienced was not necessarily final, but it was not accidental either. It was part of a larger arrangement that was only now revealing its true structure in real time. The moment everything inside the venue finally settled into its corrected arrangement, I remained standing outside the glass doors, no longer searching for entry or explanation, but simply observing the outcome of what had been unfolding in silence since my arrival that morning. Inside, the ceremony continued with a renewed sense of structure, as if the earlier disruption had been absorbed and resolved within the flow of the event itself. Guests were seated in a configuration that now appeared fully intentional, and the attention at the front of the hall was stable again, focused forward with the kind of collective stillness that marks the beginning of a formal exchange of vows. I noticed that no one inside appeared uncertain anymore, and that absence of hesitation carried its own meaning. It suggested that whatever adjustment had occurred moments earlier was not treated as an interruption, but as a correction to something that had required alignment before proceeding. I did not move closer, and I did not step away. Instead, I remained exactly where I was, allowing the distance between myself and the interior to define itself without resistance. My thoughts had shifted away from seeking validation or entry, and instead were observing patterns that had become increasingly clear. The role I once believed I held within this family structure no longer existed in the way I had imagined it, not because it was taken in a single moment, but because it had been gradually redefined long before this day arrived. I thought again about Daniel Carter, but the thought no longer carried urgency or expectation. It had transformed into recognition of placement, of how each person within this situation had already been assigned a position that I was not included in. Inside, the ceremony proceeded with calm continuity, and I could see subtle gestures of agreement and attention among the guests as the officiant began the formal proceedings. The atmosphere was composed, deliberate, and now fully synchronized. There was no longer any visible trace of the earlier adjustment, only the steady progression of an event moving forward as intended. I felt a quiet stillness within myself, not emotional collapse, not triumph, but clarity forming in a way that no longer depended on external validation. The separation that had once felt like exclusion had transformed into something more structured in my understanding, something that revealed itself not as a sudden decision, but as a sequence of alignments that had been established without my participation. I looked once more through the glass, noticing how naturally the ceremony continued, how seamlessly each moment transitioned into the next, and how complete the experience appeared from the inside perspective. In that observation, I understood something that did not require further confrontation or explanation. I was not part of what was unfolding inside, and that fact no longer demanded resistance or confusion. It simply existed as a condition of the moment. And in accepting that without struggle, I realized that the narrative I had been trying to interpret was not centered around being included or excluded in real time, but around recognizing where I had already been positioned long before I ever arrived at the door.